record. So in this blend file, I have some different collections. And maybe you haven't been using collections very much so far in your project files, but again, they are helpful ways to organize your scene. So right now I have 4. There's a rig your own, there's a pill that's rigged, there's a mushroom rig your own, and a rigged mushroom. And so we have one collection that is an object that you can rig yourself, and then there's an example of how it could be rigged. And then, again, a mushroom person you can rig yourself, and then a pre-rigged one. So, again, to like sort of toggle on and off any collection, there's like a little check box next to that, and if you hit the arrow, you can see what's inside of it. And for this first collection, it's pretty basic. We just have a cube, and that cube is made like this. It's just sort of like a cube with like one subdivide and some loop cuts along the side. Just some vertices to go on top of this so that when we rig it, there's some actual mesh resolution for it to deform on. If we try to like rig a cube that looked like that, but only had 4 vertices, it's not going to bend very well. Even if I try to do it manually, it's like this is the best it could bend, right? If I were to try to manually bend this one, the best we could do is like better, you know, like that. It kind of bends a little bit. You see what I'm saying? So I'm just added some resolution because you need the more vertexes you have in a mesh, the more clearly you can deform that or manipulate that and change that. If you only have 4 points of vertices, it's not really going to look natural if you try to bend or change the shape of that object. It's going to look distorted from the get-go. So we have this one cube with a good amount of vertices, and we're going to add an armature to it. Right now, my 3D cursor is at the center of our world, which is right at the base of this object. So if I add something to the scene, it's going to go right there at the center of it, which is great. So I'm going to go to Add, and I'm going to choose an armature. Thank you. And it doesn't look like much happened. If I go into wireframe mode, we can see that there is our first bone. And that's what it looks like right now. It looks like sort of like a triangle with sort of circles on either end to show the poles or the direction of that bone. So I just went to Add, and then I chose Armature. And make sure you're in your object mode when you do this. And so right now, we have this bone inside this cube, but it's not really very helpful to have a bone not visible, even though it is inside of this object. And so the first thing I'm going to do whenever I rig any object is I'm going to turn on the visibility for this bone. So no matter if it's inside of an object, we can still see where it exists. We can still see an outline of that object. So with this bone selected, and if you don't have it selected, just go into wireframe mode and just select it that way. We now have some new options in our properties tabs over here. Our bone constraints, which we're not going to get into. There's options for that singular bone. And then there is a tab that looks like a little stick manual like this. And that is our armature options. And again, armature is the term for the sort of structure that controls the shape. Has anyone done sculpture before? Like with clay? When you do clay, there's like a basic sort of like, sometimes you make like an armature. You make a basic sort of like either with wire or something, a sort of basic form that's like the structure of that object. Same thing here. This is the structure, the internal structure that controls or keeps the shape of our mesh. So if we look in our options here, I'm going to have to find it again. I always lose it. It's not in bone groups. It's in... Come on, tell me where it is. There's kinematics. No. 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 Maybe it's in the bone. Where is Give me 1 second. Oh, it's right in front of me. So if you go to the Armature tab for this bone, under Viewport Display, there's a little box that says In Front. If you click that, now when you go into solid mode, you still see that armature bone. You still see that bone, even though it's inside of the cube. At any angle, we can still see it, which is helpful. So, if you select your bone or armature in object mode, you go to your Armature tab, which is the little stick figure guy, and then under Viewport Display, it may be open already. There's a tab that says In Front, or a box that says In Front. Check that box. So it looks like I cut and like sort of added subdivisions in equal spacing here, and they're pretty much lined up to our grid and our background. It might be hard to see, but we have one. I could just mark it up right here. We have one here. We have a line here, here, and then of course our top. And so ideally, I want these bones to sort of rest or start and begin at each of these segments, where those sort of line segments begin. Just for this shape. It can be a little bit different with different shapes, like maybe human shapes, like meshes. But for this, I'm going to line them up like that. And so I'm going to add more bones. Right now, we just have one bone. So if we have this bone control this whole cube, all you can do is just make the whole thing rotate, because there's only one bone to control the whole thing. So we need to add more bones. And these bones are going to be contiguous. They're going to be continuous. The next bone's going to start where the last one ends. Just like imagining your legs or arm bones, they are contiguous. So with this bone selected, I'm going to go into Edit mode. And once I do that, by default, in my version of Blender, the top node of this bone is selected. And if it's not, try clicking in that top like ball of this bone. Thinking of it like a socket, like in your arm or hip bone. And I can move that around. I want it to be standing straight up at this point. So to create a new bone here from on top, like in line with this one, we can extrude one. And we can use our extrude tool, which looks a little bit different, but still exists, here on our left. Or we could just tap E. And then I tap Z to make sure it goes straight up. And again, if you're using the extrude tool, all you'd have to do is click and drag up from this plus icon. It would automatically just go straight up.
Does it matter what size they are?
So the size is dependent on their location in space, where these like sort of ball nodes exist. And you can change the size depending on their relative location. So if this node is very small, then we have a very small joint here. And because this node is at the top very far away, it's assuming that we have a very long bone right there. So we can change the size just by sort of changing the relative position of each of these nodes. For this, I want to have 4 bones. And they don't have to be exactly the same shape, and they don't have to be exactly on those lines of resolution that I created in this mesh, but I'm just sort of like doing my best to do that. So to create a new bone at the top, again, I can extrude, pull out all the way to the top, and there we go. We have 4 bones on this cube.
Other than the extrude button, how else do you make a new bone?
What's that?
Other than the extrude tool, how else do you make a new bone? Which key was it?
E. And that's after tapping, grabbing one of the ends of one of these bones. So if we wanted to, we could position these bones differently. And again, you see that they are continuous. So if you move one, they are sort of attached and they'll like pull out in reference to where that bone is. And that comes in handy if you have a different formed or a different mesh that you're trying to rig. Right now we just have a cube, so a straight line works. If we had like someone, like a human form like this, we'd want to sort of change the angle of the bones. And if anyone's tried to import like a human figure into Blender so far, you may have noticed they look like this. Yeah, that's called a T-pose. And that's just the best position you can have a human body to like rig it so that later you have the most control. Because if you had a human body like this and then you had to add bones to it, the bones here and here might interfere with each other. So you kind of like spread it out, then later you can pose it with more control and nuance. So after I have these 4 bones laid out the way I want them, I can just go back into object mode. And I'm going to save. Now, parenting, or that's what we're going to do. The way to like have a mesh be controlled by a set of bones, pretty easy. You just parent them. And then it gives you a set of options. So just like if we were going to like parent like some spotlight to a moving UFO, we first choose the thing we want to follow, that we want to be the child. And the second thing we choose is the master, the control. So first, in this situation, we'd select our mesh, which is the cube, the thing to be controlled, and then we select the master, the controller, which is the armature. I can right-click, parent, and instead of just parent object, which is what we've done before, we're just saying this object follows this object. And that's the base, that's the relationship. It's very simple. We have armature deform. There are 3 options here. The one I would suggest is with automatic weights. So we're saying we're going to parent these. This cube is going to follow this armature, but this armature also can deform the cube. And we're going to let Blender just figure out automatically the best way for these bones to control it. So I'm going to choose with automatic weights. Now if I were to select my bones, and again I'm just in object mode and move it around, it's attached. But we're just moving the whole set of bones, the whole skeleton at once. We're not moving each individual bone here. With our armature selected, we can now go into a different mode. At the top, we see we have Object, Edit to change the bones, and like to add more bones, and then we have Pose mode. If you go into Pose mode, our bones may change different colors. Now they are blue. That tells you that you can manipulate these bones. So, if I choose maybe the second set of bones here, and I could rotate them, choose the third set, rotate, fourth set, rotate, and we see we have a skeleton, an armature rather, that is now controlling this cube. And it's deforming it. It's changing the shape of it. If I wanted to go back to its original shape, I could select all the bones and then hold Option and tap R, and that clears everything. I think the way to do that in the menu is select, should be a way to clear. Clear all.
Wait,
Select.
how'd you get into that mode to change the bone structure?
Yeah, that didn't
Or it used to
happen
be
to me
an
when I
edit
clicked it.
If you're in edit mode, go to this tab. Do you see pose mode at all?
Yes.
If you see pose mode, that is the mode we use to pose the armature.
What's supposed to parent what?
So when doing this, the first thing you choose is your mesh, the thing that's supposed to be animated. The second thing you choose is the armature, the thing that's supposed to control. So the second thing you choose is always the controlling object. Think of it in like a hierarchy. The last thing is the most important or has the most control over the situation. Question?
How did you connect the bones to the mesh object?
So that's through parenting. So I'll do that one more time.
In order to like get it to move, because I was pressing like pose mode,
Uh-huh.
and I was moving my bones.
And they weren't.
I did-
Yeah. So the way you do that, again, is you would choose first, make sure you're in object mode. Choose the armature, the set of bones, which should be, oh no, sorry. Choose your cube first, which is the thing to be controlled, and then select the thing that will control, the master, which is the bone system, the armature.
So I'll have to press shift. To do
Yes.
that.
Hold shift, select the armature, and then right click, parent armature deform with automatic weights. And now if you choose the armature, you should be able to go into pose mode and control your object. And these bones are like directional. So this first bone we created, all the other bones are linked to that one. So that's sort of like the sort of base bone, the one that is like sort of like at the top of the tier. All the other ones stem from it, and because they are continuous or contiguous, each link controls the next in the link, but not the one before it. Which makes sense if you just think about the structure of your own body, you know? So if I give this a little pose, like a curve. And one thing is if we select our mesh now and look at our modifiers tab, we see that there is a modifier that was added once we parented this, once we rigged this object. And that modifier is an armature modifier, which automatically shows up once you do this, once you select your object and then your bone system and parent with automatic weights. Once you do that, it automatically gives you this armature, and it just tells Blender you just choose which bone structure you want to control it. It's one thing that happens once you create that. I could add a subdivision surface modifier to this, and now we have a cooler looking cube, or like a jelly bean. If we were to move this modifier above our armature modifier, it might behave a little bit differently. Simply because it's drawing those lines of resolution before the armature gets to affect it. But not by much. It's just a little sharper in certain areas. I tend to add subdivision after armatures if I'm doing something like that. But now that we have this jelly bean rig, we can add keyframes. I could go to frame 1. I could select all my bones in pose mode. Again, meaning that those bones are blue now. That's a visual cue at least. I could insert a keyframe for rotation, which is, you're not really going to add a keyframe for location on these bones because they're still staying within the object and they are linked to each other. So they cannot, right at this moment, independently move just on location. What you're doing is you're rotating these bones. Like when this bone inside of my forearm moves, it's not because I'm like moving that arm, it's because I'm rotating this one, which controls that one. There's like a hierarchy of motion going on. So I added a keyframe for rotation, I believe. I can move forward in time. And I could rotate these select those bones, insert keyframe for rotation. Maybe I gotta have them swing back, like, whoa. Insert a keyframe for rotation. And maybe like swing back a little bit, just like it's bouncing back into position. And then end up in its original state. So I made this little animation of these bones making this like cube jelly bean thing just go.
Just see it in
Exactly. Some nuanced things I could do to my keyframes and to the way this thing moves is that currently the way it's moving is it's like this. All the bones are moving at the same time. When I move my arms, I don't move all my bones at the same time because then I look like a robot. Maybe that's cool, but that's not how I am. When I move my arm, maybe what happens first is I move my forearm first, and then afterwards this arm moves, and then afterwards this bone continues that rotation. Like I'll go to grab this. This might move first, and the last thing's going to follow it. Not everything moves at the same time in organic motion. There's like generally sort of cascading or sort of cycles to the way things move in organic motion. Question?
If the object is a person and it's running, would that be on? Would you put it on location and rotation
We'll get to that.
with the arms and everything?
So that to do locomotion, you would create the animation of the arms moving and the legs moving, but then you would add a location keyframe to the overall armature, not the individual bones, to have the whole thing then move. So then there would be rotation for arms and limbs moving, changing the shape of the object or the person, and then there would be a location keyframe to this armature in object mode to move the whole thing, is what you do. Maybe we can do an example with this. So first, to prove my point with organic motion, if we want to make this thing look more lifelike, we might have these three bones move in sequence, just slightly. So this bone right here is bone 1, we have bone 2 and bone 3. They're just sort of named in sequence here. And if I select them, they show up in my timeline. And maybe I'll move the keyframes for bone 2 and 3 over a little bit. And then the keyframes for bone 3 over a little bit as well. So the first thing that moves, if we look at our timeline, like our keyframes here, is bone 1, which is the lowest bone. After that, the next bone starts moving a little bit. And after that, the third bone moves in sequence. And if you look at that, it looks like a more lifelike organic thing. Just that tiny little tweak. I do this all the time to everything I animate. Is to think about, if everything's moving at the same time, it's not going to look natural. So if it's specifically within one object, one sort of like living entity, specifically within living objects. So if we wanted to move this whole object, say this like swing right here, makes it like move over, we wouldn't go into pose mode and then move this and add a keyframe. You could do that, but that would like, it's like sort of changing, you're changing the shape when you change the position of the bones. You're deforming that object. And what we're doing there is not really deforming that object, we're just moving its position. So you add keyframes to the bones whenever you're like, this human or this character, its shape needs to change. That's when you change the bones. But whenever that character or whatever needs to move from here to here, then you just add a keyframe in object mode. So I go to object mode, and maybe right here I would add a keyframe for location. Maybe I could turn on automatic just to make it easy on me. Maybe because of the swing of this like sort of force, it moves over a little bit. And then winds up and moves over in the other direction. And then back to position. And our initial position was this keyframe right over here, so I could just like select it and then duplicate it over here. So now it's kind of dancing. In our next collection, any questions so far on what we've covered with this? Okay, fairly clear. In our next collection, again, in our outliner window at the top right, we have our Rig Your Own collection we've been working in. I can hide that. Oh, and when I created this armature, it wasn't placed in any collection. So now it's just sort of visible no matter what, because it's not within that Rig Your Own collection. So I could click on this in my outliner, just drop it. And now it's inside the correct collection. So if we look at scene 2, it's just a rig pill. In case you're having issues rigging your own, you can look at this as an example to play around with. So this is just how we ended up. This one looks a little bit different. It's rigged slightly different. I think the geometry is a little bit different. Question?
How did you
Yeah.
do the subdivision for the mesh again?
For which mesh?
The rectangle.
For the first one? The way I created it initially, to create this object, I'll just make it again. Create a cube. You make that cube the height you want it to be. And if I go into edit mode, I could loop cut. And I'll say the number of cuts is 3. And then loop cut here. Whoops. I use the shortcut for loop cut, which is Control R. And it's not letting me actually add to those. Oh, I see. It's because I have this. Sorry, I'm making this more complicated than it needs to be. Huh, they changed something with loop cut. Anyways, you could just do a loop cut here, a loop cut here, a loop cut here, and then the same on either side. Or you could just create one loop cut here in the middle and then select all your vertices and subdivide. That's how I created this cube, and there is a subdivision modifier on it.
Yeah, the subdivision modifier. Like, how did you get it to loop? What's that?
I just added the modifier and then made the
So why is it not a very cube? Because I don't have the little, what's it called?
I can look at your project here in a second, but maybe for now I'm just going to move on to this next, just because we got a demo going. So if we look at our next collection, we have that one that's pre-rigged, and now we have this little mushroom character that I made. Very basic. He's like, oh.
Where's the eyes?
Yeah.
I thought it was something.
Excited or terrified, I don't know, but he is a mushroom. Or she is a mushroom. Terrified is the vote so far. So, we have this one, and then in the next collection we have a pre-rigged one. But before we look at that one, how might we just as a group, let's just talk about how might we rig a character like this. So we'd have bones here, perhaps. We'd have like a spine going up. This is essentially just like our cube, where we just have a set of bones going upwards. And then we'd have our legs going down. So let's try and go through that. There's a couple things that I do differently than just that you'll see. So with this guy selected, you don't really have to select him, but our 3D cursor is still at our world origin, so we're in a good position to add a bone. It just makes it easier if everything's centered, because then you're kind of working from a good point of alignment. So if I go to add armature, we have our first bone. Again, we probably want to make sure this is in front. And so I just went to my armature settings, stick figure, and under viewport display, clicked in front. I feel like they should just have that by default just turned on. And so our first bone, we have to decide where that goes. And typically when you're rigging a character, so this first bone is going to be sort of like the master bone, the thing that controls all other bones, right? Because there's one initial one, and that is the one that all the other ones are linked to. And thinking about your own body, where might that bone exist? Just trying to think intuitively about like your own body. Your spine, somewhere in your spine. So typically it's somewhere like around your tailbone is where that might be in a character in 3D. Because that's like the point of like, it's like the point, an axis point between your leg motion and your torso motion. And if your hip moves, everything else moves basically, right? So we're going to create sort of like a hip bone master bone. And we could just start by placing this in what we imagine is like sort of the tailbone of this character-ish. He's kind of got a big butt, but typically what I do is I have my, and I just went into edit mode to make some changes. Typically what I do is I create my first bone as this sort of control bone that's sort of like imagining a tail coming out from that hip bone, the center of your hips, out the back, out of your tailbone, as sort of like a control point, like a handle. Imagine like you had like a doll or like a toy or something like that, and you just have like this handle that we're now using to like pose the overall motion of this doll or this like character. From the end of this, we're going to create our first spine bone. And again, all I did was tap E to extrude. And it doesn't have to be super vertical in this one. It doesn't have to be exactly vertical, simply because, and this will be even more apparent if you try to rig like a human being, is that no part of that body is actually perfectly vertical. We're not working with a cube anymore. We're working with a character that has slopes and curves to it. So I can move this up a little bit, generally trying to find the center of our object. In fact, maybe I'll move this over a little bit. And then I'll grab the tip of that, tap E to extrude, and we'll move it up here. E to extrude, maybe move it to the base of the cap, and then E to extrude to add another one. And I'm sort of imagining as I'm laying down these bones, which groups of mesh I'm trying to control. So if I'm like, have this layout right here, I'm imagining this centerpiece of the torso is going to be controlled by this bone. So it's going to bend at this point, yeah? This pivot point is at the base of the mushroom cap. So I'm imagining that this bone is going to pivot the cap, like that. That's kind of like what we're sort of planning out whenever we're laying down these bones. And this could actually probably work with fewer bones, but let's just try this and see how it works. Now, we have our control bone and we have our spine going upwards to the top of the head. To create the legs, you might think you'd grab this and this could work. You'd grab like sort of the control end of our base control bone here, and maybe you try to extrude from here. And you know, that could work. And generally, actually, for this, it works fine. Generally, what I tend to do and what a lot of people tend to do is have a bone offset. Because if you think about how an actual hip might move in a body, is like your hip bones are sort of like a cage here, and they do not move independently. You have your legs go into your hips right here, and they're offset from your spine. Your legs aren't connected to your spine. They're controlled by your hips, which in the way your legs are connected to your hips are offset from that. So my legs aren't going straight into my spine. I'm not like, like walking like that. That'd be weird. And it'd be fine in this, but it also creates a situation where there might be some like irregular motion in the hips, where like the hips are deforming in weird ways, where like you don't want that to happen. Like doing a dance one. So you want to maybe offset those legs from the spine. So I'm going to delete this bone, screw that. And what I could do is I could just either add a bone or just choose an existing bone. And I'm just going to grab the control, our first bone, bone 0, and I'm going to Shift D to duplicate. And I'm going to look in, this is when the number pad comes in really handy, just to switch views to be able to place. And sometimes people use a sort of 4-way screen to see like a sort of split screen 4-way, so you can see the front, left, top of this. So when you're positioning bones, you can see those positions already in orthographic. I'm going to rotate it downwards. I'm going to find what I imagine the hip might be. And let's create a new bone. We'll find what we might want the knee, where the knee exists. And how many bones do we actually need for this leg? We need 1 coming out from the hip. We need 1, and that ends where maybe the knee would be. So let's actually move this down a little bit. And let's try this. Let's have this one go down to about the knee. And then we'll give a little nub bone for this foot that doesn't exist. So it's laid out good in front. Maybe you want to move these to the center now. And again, I don't expect you to rig your own characters in this class, but it's just helpful to understand how it works. And there is an opportunity to use pre-rigged characters in this class. So this is helpful to know when doing that. And so now if I were to go into pose mode, if I were to take our control bone and move it, everything's working perfectly for the top part of our torso, but these bones down here are just sort of floating off from that. They're not connected yet. So I'm going to go back into edit mode, and I'm going to choose the first bone for my leg, and then hold shift and choose that control bone, and then I'm going to parent. Or wait, I'm going to do control P. Make parent, which is the same as parenting. Let's see if it works in the make. Okay, yeah. So if I go to right click, parent, make that parent, and we're going to say keep offset. And in doing so, we see one of those lines drawn, those dotted lines that we see whenever we parent objects to show that relation. Now we see that there's a relationship from this leg bone to our control bone. So if we go into pose mode now, that master bone controls everything, but these can still move independently. Good so far. We just need to duplicate these for the left side. We could just Shift D, move them like that, or I could Yeah, exactly. I could Shift D and then just hit escape so they drop back in the same spot. And then we'd have to do a tricky thing where we say, I want to mirror this on the Y global, but when you do so, it mirrors based on its position in just like this, whoops, this area right here. We want to mirror it based on the center of our world, which is where our cursor is. So if I do this, if I hit the period key on my main keyboard, it gives us some options as to how to pivot our objects. Usually it's median point, meaning the center of anything that's selected. I'm going to choose 3D cursor, and then if I choose to mirror, well, that's not exactly what I wanted to happen, but it mirrored based on this 3D cursor as the pivot point and just put it exactly on the other side. Just because I have there. If I go mirror now, we have the exact duplicate on the other side of this symmetrical object. We haven't really used that pivot point very often. I'm not sure exactly where that is in the menu system. I just remember it as the period key on your main keyboard. Remember the period key on your number pad makes you focus on objects. The period key on your keyboard lets you change the pivot point. Median point meaning just the center or the sort of center of two object centers. So we see the center of our plane and this mushroom, or these two dots, is pivoting on the center of those. If we change that to individual origins, then they each shrink based on their individual origins. If we choose 3D cursor, everything is controlled by where that 3D cursor is, no matter where. So we can mirror things based on that cursor, which is why that cursor can be very helpful sometimes. Anyway, so we have our bone structure set up. We can now choose the mushroom, then hold Shift, choose the armature, right-click, parent, and what's our option we're going to choose? Anybody? Yeah, right. Armature deform with automatic weights. Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. I'm going to drop that armature on the right thing. Now, if I choose the bone structure, I can go into post mode. And now I can control this cool mushroom dude. And it seems like he's moving a little weird. Let's try, I'm going to look at his modifiers. I'm going to select his mesh. And I'm going to move the subdivider beneath the armature, because I had a subdivision on this guy. He's pretty blocky. So this is what he looks like without the modifier. Pretty basic. That's all he is. You add that subdivide modifier. Smooth him out. You want that modifier to be after your armature. And now we could like try to make him walk if you wanted to. Walk cycles are hard to do. The first time you try, it might look a little weird because it's kind of complex motion to think about it. There's a lot of things moving to get a realistic walk. There's a lot of different cycles, a lot of curves going on. Like again, like when I'm walking, it's not like my head's in the same position the whole time. When I'm walking, it's like bouncing up and down. Like there's like a rhythm to things, there's a gait. Not all things are moving at the same time, yet they need to repeat over time. If you want to try to do a walk cycle, that's awesome. There are some you can find for free online if you want to do that. But if you do, try studying. There's a lot of references. There's a lot of like reference drawings and other content to like study walk cycles. So you can sort of look at each frame and be like, okay, so that's like how that rhythm works. Let's try real quick though. I'll just look at this mushroom from the side, go into pose mode. Let's start with maybe, we'll do a very basic one, like the first step away. Just start with that. We might not even get it because it's kind of hard. But we'll do something simple. Add rotation. Let me make that frame 0. So this is 1 stride. Let's go forward maybe 10. Maybe we'll make it really fast so he's like that. And then we can't really tell what's going on that much. So it looks cool maybe. And then we could switch him. So the other leg is kind of in the same position. The other one's like that. That could be a set of rotation keyframes. And so, I want this one to be more curved like the other one. What's going on here? I want to add nuance to it already, but I'm not going to. So just a very basic one. We could take the first set of keyframes, duplicate them, so we have a cycle going on. And then, so we have these 2 motions. I'm going to make it go faster because it'll be more funny. And we have like the strokes we need for this leg to move, for it to cycle through this. If we wanted to repeat this, if all we wanted is for our character to just be walking and just sort of like looking at stuff maybe, we could just have these leg animations repeat independently from everything else. And the way we could do that is we look at our dear friend, the graph editor. And remember the graph editor, I mean, one thing we could do, which is go back into the dope sheet, we could just say, hey, this repeats every 10 frames. I could hit Shift D to duplicate, type in, oh, whoops, no, not 10 frames, 9 frames. Just like duplicate this a whole bunch. And I just like figured out through math how many frames there are in this animation, and then just like Shift D, hit 9 on the number pad, enter. And now we just have a bunch of frames. Another thing we could do, which may take more time or less, I'm not sure exactly, is to go into our graph editor. And if we choose one of these motions, we can see the curves of that motion for each of these bones. And I can go into our hidden menu to the left, which you can tap N or look for that really hard to find arrow. And we have modifiers. So there's modifiers you can add to your keyframes in your graph editor. And the one we're going to try is cycles. So I see this is one motion here, and I think that's for, I'm not sure which bone that's for. I could add a modifier, which is cycles. And if I add that, it just endlessly repeats those motions. And you see that's for this bone right here, which is bone 5. I could select our next bone, look at the values that are actually changing, which is Z and W, which is kind of weird to think about. Add cycles. If I know I'm adding cycles to a lot of things, I could just say, hey, copy that modifier, which is this little like up to the clipboard, copy it to the clipboard, and then I select another one, paste it. And if I want to do this like pretty quickly, I could just do this for our main bones here. And now it kind of looks like a crab a little bit. I'm going to do this. It's going to be very like robotic, but it'll be funny. I'm going to clear the keyframes. That didn't work. Anyways. So now this person is endlessly walking. We could now go back to our dope sheet. We could add a keyframe for the location of the mushroom. Have him walk into scene. Maybe location rotation. Have them walk over here. Maybe rotate too. Location rotation. And then maybe walk over here. Oops. Might look a little weird with the rotation, but hey, here we go. Just walking around. Very basic. Hey, what's up? Another thing we could do, just real quick, because I think this is fun, in our graph editor, a cool modifier I like to use, we just introduce the idea of modifiers, and you don't have to use them. They can be helpful. We just added a cycles, a repeating modifier to some of our bones here. If I wanted to choose just like this spine bone and just have them be like, ugh, like freaking out in a random way, I could add a keyframe for rotation. I could choose one of those values for that. So maybe X rotation. Find it in that mess of graph here. Then I'd add a modifier, and it would be a noise modifier. And what a noise modifier is, that it just generates a random value over a set of time and applies that to the value of your keyframe. So he's like freaking out. So right now it's very like that, like vibrating basically. Yeah, he's really freaking out. And what we could do here is look at the modifier. So we have on this modifier, scale, strength are our main values. Scale is the scaling over time. If we raise that value, we see the time or the rate of that randomness smooths out. So we now see is like that, as opposed to like, you know? We can do the same. We can also change the strength. Strength being the amount of change that happens randomly over time. So if we make it very high, he's like, oh God. Somehow that's changing all of them. That doesn't make any sense. Oh, I'm not adding that to the bone. I'm adding that to his actual the transform for his whole armature. I was selecting the wrong value. I needed to be in the bone, and then if I choose one of those values there, where is that? Where is it? That works. This one? Yeah, let's do it. Oh, okay. That one. If I add noise to this one, now it's just that bone that's having that happen. I can change, I can zoom in here to see the values a little bit better.
Looks very panicked.
Very panicked. I could change the strength of that. So he's like, wah, like that, head banging. Or just like a very subtle tick. You could change the scale again. So he's like, I could copy that modifier I just created with those same settings. I could find another one of those rotational bones he has, paste it, and then I could change the offset so it's just happening a little bit afterwards, which would have the same sort of like fluid locomotion that I added to the cube originally with the noise modifier. So the same sort of randomness is happening to the next bone or another value, just at a different moment over time. Anyways, if you didn't rig the mushroom in this and you wanted to play around with pre-rigged one, in collection 4, there is a rigged mushroom. If you wanted to play around with character motion.
Can you go over the parenting of the legs?
Of the what?
Of the legs?
Yeah. So, and I built this one actually with them connected, and it should work fine. But the way I did it, it's like, it's me, is I created a bone, or I duplicated a set from another one. Once I had that bone structure the way I wanted it, I chose the top bone in that string, the control bone in that string for the legs, selected that one first, then that control bone I created, or whichever is the main top of the chain for your spine. Again, leg, shift, select the next one, and then control P, or right click, parent, make, and then I say keep offset, which means it's still being controlled by that bone, but it's not connected to it. So it's parent, make, keep offset. Okay. I'm going to stop this demo video portion. We can still, whoa, hey. And because I changed those values, and there were keyframes, look at our dude now. Very glitchy.